At the time of the offense, my diagnosis was schizophrenia.
3 mental health experts testified for the defense. All said she was insane at the time of the homicide and could not appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions.
My view was that she was completely out of her mind.
Dr. Anthony Smartnick, her treating psychiatrist, said Powell's symptoms are real and the medication he's prescribing is helping.
Pretending that one is mentally ill and pretending that for various gain, for various purposes. No time did I have that concern.
The legal test to find Sidney Powell not guilty by reason of insanity is twofold. First, jurors had to answer the question of whether Sidney was insane at the time of the crime, and second, whether she could appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. And it was the answer to that second question that ultimately led to their verdict.
That eventually is what threw us over, because we couldn't, especially on that second piece, with the understanding that she was making up a story about somebody intruding. Well, we couldn't get past that.
She walks into the courtroom smiling, as if none of it matters. 19 years old, Sidney Powell glances at the cameras, then at her father sitting motionless in the second row. Her mother's family watches in disbelief. The judge hasn't spoken yet, but tension cuts through the room like a wire pulled too tight. Reporters whisper. Someone gasps. Then Sidney laughs. A quiet, unsettling laugh that freezes everyone in place. The courtroom feels colder now. Before this moment, she was just a college student from Akron. Her mother, Brenda, a hospital worker loved by everyone who knew her. But all that ended one March morning, in the same home where they once shared breakfast and laughter. A phone rang, a secret was exposed, and in minutes, everything changed. March 3rd, 2020, Akron, Ohio. The clock on the kitchen wall read 10:03 a.m. when the call came in. Brenda Powell, 50 years old, answered with her usual warmth, her voice steady as she spoke to administrators from the University of Mount Union. On the other end of the line, 2 school officials tried to explain that her daughter, Sidney, had been dismissed after failing several courses. Brenda's tone shifted, the calm breaking. "There must be some mistake," she said. "My daughter's been attending classes. She talks about her professors." One of the administrators replied quietly, "Ma'am, she hasn't been enrolled this semester." For a moment, there was only silence, and then a muffled noise, a thud. The sound of movement, a faint cry, and the line went dead. Within minutes, Akron police were dispatched to the home on Nob Hill Avenue. Officers Mark Scudder and Caitlin Miller were the first to arrive, their body cameras capturing every second that followed. The front door was ajar, the morning air mixing with something sharper, metallic. Officer Miller called out, "Akron police, anyone inside?" A figure appeared in the doorway. It was Sidney. She was barefoot, shaking, her hands streaked with blood. Her voice cracked as she said, "Someone broke in. Please. My mom. Someone hurt her." The officers exchanged a quick glance. Miller asked, "Where is she?" Sidney pointed inside, eyes unfocused, repeating, "She told me to run." The footage shows the officers stepping past her into the living room. Furniture had been knocked over, a coffee mug shattered on the floor. The phone lay still off the hook, the line open to a college office 3 counties away. Brenda Powell was found near the bottom of the stairs, unconscious, her pulse fading. Officer Scudder's voice is heard on the footage saying, "We need medics, now." He pressed his hand to her shoulder, calling her name twice, but she didn't respond. Blood pooled around her, dark against the hardwood. Moments later, the paramedics rushed in. They worked in near silence, each second heavy, but by the time they lifted her onto the stretcher, it was clear she was gone. Outside, Sidney stood by the patrol car, hugging herself, her voice trembling as she told Officer Miller, "I heard a bang. I tried to help her. There was someone in the house." But her story began to falter under simple questions. "What did they look like?" Miller asked. I didn't see them. I just ran." When she lifted her hands to wipe her face, streaks of red appeared on her cheek. The camera caught it. She looked down, realizing, whispering, "That's my mom's blood." before turning away, crying into her sleeve. A neighbor, Patricia Hayes, told detectives she had seen Sydney outside just before the sirens arrived, pacing in the driveway and talking to herself. She looked lost, Patricia recalled later, like she didn't know where she was. Officers canvassed the area, searching for signs of forced entry, broken windows, footprints, anything, but nothing fit her story. The back door was locked, and the kitchen window was intact. The only fingerprints found belonged to Brenda and Sydney. At 10:41 a.m., Brenda Powell was officially pronounced dead at Akron City Hospital. The lead detective notified her husband, Steve Powell, who rushed home from work. When he arrived, the house was surrounded by police tape. In body cam footage, his voice breaks as he says, "Where's my wife? Where's my daughter?" An officer steps forward, lowering his tone. "Mr. Powell, we need you to stay back." Steve shakes his head, trying to push past. "I just want to see her," he pleads. But he's held back gently, confusion and fear written all over his face. Detectives separated Sydney for questioning at the scene. Her tone shifted again, flat, detached. "I don't remember what happened," she told them. "I was in the kitchen, then everything went blank." When asked if she had argued with her mother, she said softly, "She was just asking questions about school." Investigators later confirmed the call from the college had been ongoing when the attack began. Administrators on the other end told police they heard Brenda's voice suddenly stop, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. One of them shouted into the phone, "Mrs. Powell, are you there?" before calling 911. As detectives moved through the house, they noted that Sydney's clothes were soaked with blood, her feet cut by glass. There were no footprints from anyone else. In the background of the footage, a radio crackles with the dispatcher's voice, confirming one victim, female, deceased. Possible suspect is her daughter. Outside, Steve Powell stands by his car, his hands shaking as he looks toward the house wrapped in yellow tape. For him, it's still unthinkable. A few hours ago, his wife had called to say she'd talk with their daughter and everything would be fine. Now he's standing in the cold, waiting for answers that make no sense. The camera lingers on him for a moment before fading out as officers escort Sydney to a patrol car. Her face is blank, her eyes distant, her voice quiet as she repeats one last time, "Someone broke in." The door closes, and the car pulls away, leaving behind a home that will never again feel like home. Detectives sealed off the house that afternoon, taking in the silence that followed the chaos. The front door showed no signs of damage. The windows were locked from the inside. Nothing was stolen. The absence of forced entry told its own story. Whoever hurt Brenda Powell hadn't needed to break in. Detective Mark Scudder turned to his partner and said quietly, "She opened that door for someone she trusted." Inside, the crime scene unit moved methodically. Photos were taken of blood spatter on the walls, droplets leading from the kitchen toward the staircase, the direction of each marking suggesting motion, fast, violent, desperate. The coffee pot on the counter was still warm, and the family's morning routine, from half-eaten toast to a folded work badge, was frozen in time.
Where police found her mother's blood.
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. No, I came back.
We didn't find those stories to be insane. She's obviously trying to cover up. There's no other thing that could be going on here. And after reading hundreds and maybe thousands of texts, she was a normal college kid that lost track of her way because she didn't like what she was doing in college. And lots of kids in college lose that structure and have a difficult time. She wanted to hide from her parents. And so she started down this lying street, and she couldn't get out. Apparently,
the investigators knew early on this wasn't a random attack. Sydney sat in the interview room at the Akron Police Department, a gray blanket around her shoulders, eyes vacant. When asked to recount what happened, her story changed with every question. "I heard glass break," she said once. Then, "She told me to run." Detectives pressed further. Who broke in, Sydney? Did you see them? She shook her head. I don't remember, she whispered. Her tone shifted between calm and panic, detachment and sudden tears, and it puzzled even experienced investigators. But her hands still bore small cuts, consistent with gripping something sharp. Crime lab analysts began running swabs and testing fingerprints, while detectives compared timelines from her phone, the 911 call, and the university's records. By evening, the truth began taking shape in evidence, not words. Forensic analysts mapped the entire scene with lasers and digital overlays. The pattern of blood stains showed movement from the kitchen to the hallway, then upward. A frantic, prolonged attack. The knife used was recovered in the sink, the handle wiped once but still carrying prints. It matched the set found in the kitchen drawer. A frying pan nearby bore traces of hair and tissue consistent with blunt force trauma. Detective Scudder later testified. The position of the body and evidence suggested Brenda had turned away, possibly while on the phone, when the first blow came. Phone records confirmed the University of Mount Union's administrators had heard the start of the assault live before the line went dead. One official told investigators, "We heard her say, 'Sydney, what are you doing?' And then there was a crash." The discovery of motive came from paperwork found in Sydney's bedroom, letters from the university informing her of academic dismissal, never opened, hidden in a drawer. Digital forensics revealed emails from professors expressing concern, messages Sydney had ignored. Investigators also learned she'd been telling her parents she was still attending classes and volunteering on campus. Her laptop search history included phrases like, "How to tell parents you failed out," and expelled students' consequences. It painted a picture of a young woman suffocating under pressure and fear of disappointment. But shame alone couldn't explain the violence they'd just documented. Detectives began exploring her mental state, pulling text messages between her and friends. One, dated February 28th, read, "I can't sleep anymore. Mom's gonna hate me if she finds out." Another friend told police, "She was different lately. Quiet, like she was somewhere else even when you were talking to her." As the investigation deepened, detectives reconstructed the final minutes before the attack using timestamps from the university's call logs. Brenda had picked up the phone at 10 a.m. At 10:09, the first sound of distress was recorded. Officers were dispatched by 10:12. That left only a few minutes between confrontation and collapse. The speed of the escalation stunned investigators. "There was no planning, no theft, no attempt to flee," one officer said. "It looked like pure rage or confusion that lasted only moments." But rage from what? The question lingered as they awaited the coroner's report. When it came, the findings left the team in silence. Brenda Powell had suffered at least 24 stab wounds to her neck and torso, and multiple skull fractures consistent with being struck by a frying pan. The medical examiner concluded the assault lasted roughly 3 to 4 minutes. Brenda had likely been alive during most of it. The autopsy confirmed no defensive wounds beyond a few small cuts, suggesting she was caught off guard, possibly turning when the attack began. "She never saw it coming," the examiner said during deposition. The brutality of the injuries contradicted Sydney's calm demeanor, deepening the mystery of her mindset. Detectives brought Steve Powell back for a follow-up interview. They asked about his daughter's recent behavior. He said she'd been home since February after leaving her dorm, claiming her classes were online. "She was quieter than usual," he said softly. "I thought it was just stress." Brenda was worried but wanted to give her space. When told the results of the investigation, Steve lowered his head, saying, "My wife loved her more than anything. She would have forgiven anything." His words broke the last remaining doubt. By the end of that week, the case file was thick with evidence, lab results, call transcripts, and witness statements. Every line pointed inward, toward a home that had turned against itself. Detectives who once hoped for an explanation from outside found only silence from within. The last report, logged that day, summarized it plainly. No forced entry, all evidence consistent with domestic origin. Primary suspect, Sydney Powell. It was no longer a question of who, but why, and that question would lead them straight into a courtroom where her demeanor would shock everyone again. The interrogation room at the Akron Police Department was cold and silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was March 4th, 2020, barely 24 hours after Brenda Powell's death. Sydney sat across from two detectives, her hair pulled back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She stared at the wall for long stretches, unblinking, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "I didn't do anything," she said. Her tone was flat, almost rehearsed. Detective Scudder leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Sydney, no one else, was in that house. You and your mother were the only ones there. No one broke in. You know that, right?" There was no response, just the faint sound of her breathing. When he pressed again, she whispered, "I heard a bang." It was the same line she had given at the scene, the same hollow answer that made little sense. Her story hadn't changed, but it also hadn't explained anything. The footage later released by prosecutors shows the moment when Detective Miller placed a photo of Brenda on the table. "This is your mother," she said quietly. "She was alive when we got there, but we couldn't save her. Tell us what happened." Sydney's eyes flickered for a second, then dropped to the floor. "I don't remember," she said. "I was scared." When detectives asked if she had argued with her mother that morning, she shook her head. She was mad about school, she admitted softly, her voice trembling, but she wasn't yelling. They asked if she hit her. Sydney didn't answer. After nearly 2 hours of questioning, she was led out of the room, expression still blank, her silence heavier than any confession. By the end of that week, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office filed 4 formal charges: purposeful murder, felony murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. The indictment stated that Sydney Powell did knowingly cause the death of another, Brenda Powell, with prior calculation and design. It was a shocking turn for a young woman who had once been described by teachers as bright and gentle. Prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh told reporters, "This is one of the most difficult cases we've seen. A mother killed in her own home by the person she trusted most." Her words echoed through local news broadcasts across Ohio. As the investigation expanded, Sydney's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They claimed she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and suffered a psychotic break at the time of the killing. Psychiatrist Dr. Sylvia O'Leary, called by the defense, later testified that Sydney exhibited symptoms of disassociation and auditory hallucinations.
In my opinion, with a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, Sydney Powell had schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, a first episode, and was in an acute psychotic state at the time of the offense.
How does that impact your opinion that she did not know the wrongfulness of her conduct during those 3.5 minutes?
My view was that she was completely out of her mind.
And have you seen that at psychiatric hospitals with patients who are experiencing psychotic breaks as a result of schizophrenia?
Yes.
Heard from defense experts that this is referred to the lost week that Sydney had. And by lost week, that they have testified that Sydney was already broken from reality at this point. When she left Mount Union, she was already starting this psychotic break from reality.
She did not understand the nature of her actions, O'Leary said in court filings. But prosecutors argued that her behavior before and after the murder showed clear awareness. She had tried to create the illusion of a break-in, wiped the knife handle, and answered questions with consistency about hearing a bang. "That's not confusion," Prosecutor Walsh countered. "That's concealment." The mental health evaluation sparked weeks of back and forth. Court-appointed forensic psychologist Dr. Daniel Hrinko concluded that Sydney had major depressive and psychotic features, but was still legally sane under Ohio law, meaning she understood what she was doing was wrong. His report noted, while Ms. Powell displayed signs of mental illness, her efforts to mislead investigators suggest purposeful action rather than total detachment from reality. That assessment would later become a cornerstone of the state's case against her. Meanwhile, in Akron, public sympathy began to fracture. At first, neighbors described the Powells as a good family, quiet, church-going, ordinary. But as more evidence surfaced, the tone changed. The community struggled to process what they saw on court TV when the police body cam footage was released in 2023, 3 years after the killing. The video showed Sydney outside the house, hands covered in blood, telling officers someone broke in, while her mother lay dying inside. That footage went viral within hours, spreading from news outlets to social media, reigniting outrage across the country. Viewers commented that she looked emotionless, disconnected, even manipulative. Others defended her, arguing that mental illness can mimic detachment. "That girl's eyes look empty," one viewer posted. "If that's not illness, I don't know what is." As the story gained national coverage, reporters filled the courtroom during preliminary hearings. Sydney often appeared expressionless, her movements slow and deliberate. When Judge Allison McCarty addressed her, asking if she understood the charges, she simply said, "Yes, ma'am." Her voice was steady, her posture straight. The judge ordered her held on a $1 million bond pending trial. The court's decision deepened the divide between those who saw her as sick and those who saw her as cold-blooded. Through it all, Steve Powell attended every hearing, sitting quietly behind the prosecution's table. He refused interviews, but his face said enough. He had lost both his wife and his daughter in the same day. During one hearing, a reporter noted that he mouthed the words, "Why?" when Sydney was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Family members of Brenda Powell described him as broken but dignified, standing for his wife's memory. By late 2022, the court had ruled Sydney competent to stand trial, and preparations began for what would become one of Summit County's most closely followed murder cases. Every transcript, every frame of interrogation footage painted a picture that was both baffling and tragic. A young woman caught between reality and delusion, guilt and denial. But as the trial approached, the question that haunted everyone remained the same. Was Sydney Powell a victim of her own mind, or a calculating killer trying to escape what she had done? The tension in the community only grew when Court TV announced they would air the full trial live. Families of both sides braced themselves for what was coming. Prosecutors promised a clear timeline and hard evidence. The defense promised an inside look at a fractured mind. What followed would shake even those who thought they had seen everything. Because when Sydney Powell finally took her place at the defense table, and the body cam video played for the jury, her reaction, calm, detached, and almost indifferent, left the entire courtroom frozen. And as the judge looked down from the bench, the air in that room felt heavier than ever before. September 2023. 3 years after the killing, the courtroom in Summit County was silent as the trial of 19-year-old Sydney Powell began. Reporters filled every bench, notebooks open, cameras pointed at the defense table. The prosecution called it a killing born of lies. Assistant Prosecutor Brian Loprinzi stood before the jury, his voice steady but sharp. This was not an accident. This was not a psychotic episode without awareness. This was a young woman who did not want to face her mother after being expelled from college. And instead of telling the truth, she ended a life. Across the room, the defense countered with their version. Attorney Donald Hicks rose slowly, gesturing toward his client. "Sydney Powell is not a monster," he said. "She is a young woman who lost touch with reality. She suffered a mental collapse. She loved her mother. She does not even remember what she did." The clash of those two narratives set the tone for what would become one of the most emotionally charged trials Akron had ever seen. From the beginning, the prosecution leaned on evidence, not speculation. They replayed the 911 call logs, the body cam footage, and the testimony from the university officials who had been on the phone with Brenda when the attack began. One of the administrators, in a trembling voice, told the court, "We heard Brenda say, 'Sydney, stop. What are you doing?'" Then there was a loud crash, and nothing after that. The words drew quiet gasps from the gallery. The state's case detailed every cut, every movement, every piece of forensic data, the wiped knife handle, the hidden academic letters, the false story of a break-in. As the body cam video played, jurors leaned forward, watching Sydney standing barefoot outside her house, blood on her hands, telling police, "Someone broke in." Her eyes flickered, but she did not cry. Her face, unreadable. Her composure unsettled even the courtroom officers. Prosecutors argued that her calm was not confusion, but control. "That's not psychosis," Loprinzi said in his closing argument. "That's a person trying to cover what she's done." Expert witnesses testified about her mental health. The defense's psychiatrist repeated that Sydney had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and psychotic depression. "She was hearing voices," Dr. Sylvia O'Leary said, "and under extreme psychological stress. She believed she was in danger." But the state's expert, Dr. Daniel Hrinko, gave a different conclusion. Sydney Powell knew the difference between right and wrong, he told the jury. She fabricated an intruder. That's awareness. That's intent. His words landed heavily, reinforcing the prosecution's theme. Awareness equals guilt. Throughout the proceedings, Sydney sat motionless, her eyes lowered. When the body cam footage ended, the room fell quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Jurors exchanged glances, some visibly shaken. A few family members wept quietly in the back row. Steve Powell sat alone, his hands clasped tightly. For him, there was no side to choose. During one recess, he told a reporter softly, "I lost both of them that day. I just want the truth." When the trial resumed, prosecutors displayed photos of Brenda Powell's hospital badge, her blood-stained shirt, and a small gold ring recovered from the kitchen floor. "This is not just evidence," the prosecutor said. "This is a mother's life. This is trust broken beyond repair." As the defense made their final plea, they focused on Sydney's mental state. "She has been medicated, hospitalized, and evaluated," Hicks said. "She is sick, not evil. Her mind fractured under the pressure of failure and fear. Punishment cannot fix what was already broken." The jury watched her closely as her attorney spoke, but Sydney remained still. No tears, no visible reaction. The emotional toll was clearer on the families in the gallery than on her face. When the closing arguments ended, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. They took only 5 hours to return. On September 20th, 2023, the courtroom filled again. Everyone stood as the jury filed back in, eyes downcast, verdict forms in hand. The foreperson read clearly, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sydney Powell, guilty of purposeful murder, felony murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence." There was a sharp gasp from the gallery. Some of Brenda's relatives sobbed. Reporters scribbled notes. Sydney looked straight ahead, and for the first time, a faint smirk crossed her lips. The expression lasted only seconds, but it drew immediate reaction. One woman in the gallery whispered, "How can she smile?" while another family member covered their mouth in disbelief. The judge, Honorable Allison McCarty, paused before speaking, her eyes fixed on Sydney. The silence that followed was heavier than any sentence. When Judge McCarty finally spoke, her tone was low and deliberate. "Miss Powell," she began, "you took from this world a woman who gave you life, a woman who loved you unconditionally, who stood by you through everything. The court will not forget her, even if you can." The words cut through the room. Steve Powell lowered his head as tears filled his eyes. The judge continued, "You will serve life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. This is not a punishment meant for vengeance, but for accountability." The sentence echoed through the courtroom like a final judgment on a tragedy that had already taken everything. As the deputies prepared to escort Sydney out, she turned briefly toward the gallery, her face expressionless once more. The families of both victim and defendant sat divided by grief and disbelief, bound by a single loss that neither verdict nor years could undo. Reporters later noted that when the judge's gavel fell, no one clapped, no one cheered. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was the closing of a wound that would never fully heal. Outside, cameras flashed as the courthouse doors opened. Some reporters asked Steve Powell if he had anything to say. He paused before answering, Brenda was the best person I ever knew. I just hope her story reminds people to listen, to check on their kids, to talk before it's too late." Then he walked away quietly, leaving behind a courtroom that had seen the unthinkable. And as the lights dimmed that evening, the community of Akron was left with a single haunting question. How could a home once filled with love end in silence and steel bars? The sentence was final: life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. When Judge Allison McCarty's gavel fell, the courtroom fell into silence that seemed to stretch beyond the walls. Sidney Powell was led away, hands cuffed, her head bowed, showing no visible emotion. For a few seconds, all that could be heard was the quiet sobbing of Brenda Powell's family. Outside, the media waited, microphones pointed toward the courthouse steps, asking if justice had been served. There were no cheers, no sense of victory, just heartbreak. What the sentence gave was closure on paper, but in truth, it reopened wounds that could never fully heal. Back on Nob Hill Avenue, the house still stood. Ordinary, almost peaceful from the outside. But anyone who lived nearby knew that home would never feel ordinary again. Neighbors still spoke in low tones about that morning in March. The porch light, once left on for Brenda's late drives home from the hospital, still glowed every night, switched on by Steve Powell before he went to bed. He kept it that way, he said, because Brenda didn't like the dark. The blinds remained drawn, but every now and then, flowers appeared on the porch, left by Brenda's co-workers, by former patients' parents, by people who had never met her but were moved by her story. Patricia Hayes, the neighbor who first saw the police cars that day, told a reporter, "No one ever turned off that light. It's like she's still there somehow." At Akron Children's Hospital, Brenda's memory lived on through her colleagues. In the pediatric oncology unit, where she'd spent nearly 2 decades comforting families and caring for sick children, a small plaque was placed above her favorite chair. It read, "In memory of Brenda Powell, whose kindness made hard days easier." Nurse Carla Jenkins, who worked beside her for years, said during an interview, "She was the kind of person who'd bring coffee to parents who hadn't slept in days. Even after her shift ended, she'd stay if a child was scared. She gave more than she ever took." During the trial, many of those same co-workers attended in quiet solidarity, some wearing pins that bore her initials. After the sentencing, they held a candlelight vigil outside the hospital entrance. Dr. Anthony Miller, a pediatric oncologist, said softly that night, "The hardest part is knowing her last act was still an act of care, trying to reach her daughter, trying to help her, even when everything went wrong." Across the city, the case reignited conversations about mental health in young adults. Schools and colleges began hosting open forums about academic stress and untreated psychological disorders. The University of Mount Union released a statement expressing condolences to the Powell family and acknowledging the tragedy as a reminder of the silent crises faced by students struggling with pressure, fear, and self-doubt. Counselors from nearby universities spoke to local news about the warning signs of psychosis and depression, withdrawal, insomnia, sudden mood shifts, signs many overlook until it's too late. Dr. Hrinko, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Sidney, told a journalist, "There's a line between illness and accountability, but we can't keep waiting until tragedy draws it for us. We have to intervene sooner." His words resonated far beyond the courtroom. Parents watched, teachers listened, and communities began asking harder questions about how easily hidden pain can grow into catastrophe. Meanwhile, Sidney Powell remained at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. The Department of Corrections listed her inmate number, her sentence, and her parole eligibility date, March 2038. She was 19 when she entered. She will be 34 when she can first request release. Officials described her as quiet, compliant, often reading or sitting alone in the yard. She received psychiatric treatment and medication for her diagnosed disorders. Her father, Steve, visited her once during her first year of incarceration. A staff member later said he sat across from her in the visitation room, tears in his eyes, and told her, "Your mom loved you every day of her life." She nodded but said nothing. That was the last time he visited. In an interview months later, he said softly, "I see both of them in my dreams. Brenda's face, Sydney's voice. I don't know what to pray for anymore." As the years passed, Brenda's story continued to ripple through Akron. Each March, on the anniversary of her death, friends and family gathered on the sidewalk outside the house. They lit candles, shared memories, and prayed for healing. Some nights, a soft rain fell, and people said it felt like the world was mourning with them. Others said it was a reminder how quickly life can change inside a home that once felt safe. Local students started an annual essay scholarship in her name, the Brenda Powell Award for Compassion in Nursing, honoring the legacy of the woman whose greatest gift was care. Yet for all the tributes, one image never left the minds of those who followed the case: the pair of shoes still sitting by the door. They were Brenda's favorite work shoes, the ones she slipped on every morning before driving to the hospital. Steve never moved them. Visitors said he kept them exactly where she'd left them, next to a folded umbrella and a faded welcome mat. To him, they weren't just shoes. They were proof of a life that once filled that house with light, laughter, and love. In the end, that small detail became the symbol of everything this story carried. A home that once knew warmth, a family torn by silence, and a tragedy that left behind questions with no easy answers. Brenda's colleagues still talk about her smile. Her patients, now grown, still remember her voice. And as the porch light continues to burn through the nights in Akron, the story of Brenda and Sydney Powell stands as both a heartbreak and a warning. Some promises end quietly, but their echoes never fade. In the end, there are no winners. What happened inside that quiet Akron home destroyed 3 lives at once. A mother who spent her life helping sick children never made it back to her patients, to the laughter that used to echo through the oncology wing when she entered the room. Her chair at the hospital still sits empty, her badge still hanging from its lanyard. Her kindness is remembered in every hallway, her voice in every nurse who now tells a frightened child, "It's okay, I'm right here." Brenda Powell gave her life to easing the pain of others, and no one imagined her own end would become the kind of tragedy she spent her career helping people survive. A daughter who once dreamed of success now counts the years behind bars. Sydney Powell, once a bright student, now wakes up in a concrete cell where the days are measured by mealtimes and medication. The courtroom's verdict was clear, but the silence that followed was louder than any sentence could ever be. She no longer hears her mother's voice calling her name, only the echo of it in her mind, a memory she cannot escape. There are those who say she deserves the full weight of her punishment, and others who say her mind broke long before that morning. But no matter where you stand, her story leaves behind a question too painful to ignore. What if someone had noticed sooner? What if the warning signs had been seen? What if she had asked for help? And a father wakes every day to an empty house. Steve Powell lives quietly now, away from cameras, away from questions. He told a reporter once, "People ask how I keep going. I don't. I just keep breathing." He still visits Brenda's grave every March, always bringing yellow flowers, her favorite color. He still leaves the porch light on, the one Brenda hated to turn off because she said, "You never know who might need to find their way home." Some stories don't end with justice. They end with lessons. This one reminds us that silence can be deadly, that love cannot always cure what we don't understand, and that even the kindest hearts can be broken by secrets left unspoken. If this story stayed with you, share her name. Say Brenda Powell's name. Remember the mother who cared, the daughter who lost herself, and the father who still keeps the light on. Because remembering her is the only way to make sure it never happens again. If Brenda's story moved you, don't let it fade when the video ends. Talk about it. Share it. Start the conversation about mental health, family pressure, and the quiet struggles too many people hide behind a smile. If you believe no parent should have to face what Steve Powell lives with, hit the like button, leave a comment with her name, and share this video so her light reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe for more true stories that matter. Stories that remind us that empathy isn't weakness. It's the first step toward change. Because the next time someone you love falls silent, your voice might be the one that saves them.